To this webinar series on the power to discriminate. Just a couple of house rules before we get started. If I can ask that everyone switch off their videos as well as their microphones, just to also help save bandwidth. It's much appreciated. And then also, if I can ask that you do not use the chat function at all during the presentations. This will just, be distracting also to the audience as well as the speakers. Then once the conversation starts, both the presentations, we ask the presenters to keep under 25, maximum 30 minutes. So after the two presentations, we will go into a time for conversation, and then you are welcome to pose also questions to the presenters, so we get the maximum number of questions that the presenters can also attend to then. So this Power to Discriminate webinar series, 6 weeks, that's starting today, is actually part of the conference that with the same theme that my colleague Andrea Schule, who is the first presenter today, that we planned and that we were almost ready to hold in March, just before COVID-19. I think we can be safe to say that we were one of the first casualties of COVID-19. So Andreas was already here, and also some of the other presenters. But then we unfortunately had to cancel that week, just as our university also was on the point of shutting down. But we decided that we want to do something with this very rich contributions and the energy around this topic. So we have now 6 weeks of a webinar series with 12 of the presenters that will presenting in the next 6 weeks. And we are taping this hour and a half session so that we, in the end, will be able to put that also together and share that also to a wider audience as part of a one day or a consultation on the topic of the power to discriminate, rethinking the theme of perversion in the Old Testament. So it's now my privilege to introduce to you Professor Andreas Schule. He is Professor of Old Testament Theology and Exegesis at Leipzig University. I got to know him when he was teaching in the United States at Union Theological Seminary. I was teaching just across from the road, and we lived in the same neighborhood, a very funky neighborhood in Church Hill. And then around about the same time, he moved to Germany, back to Leipzig. I moved back to Stellenbosch, but we stayed in touch and kept on being friends. And he's now also a visiting professor at the Department of Old and New Testament at the Faculty of Theology, and we have an exchange with Leipzig University. So quite a few of us have also already been to Leipzig, and he and some of his students have been to Stellenbosch. And so this is an initiative that we thought we could do together. So our department and his department, and so it's been really a joy also working with him, conceptualizing this when I was last year in Leipzig, a visiting scholar there for 2 weeks. He's been here also teaching some of my classes just before the lockdown. So that was a lot of fun. But in any case, so Andreas, we're looking forward to listening to you. I'm going to share now I'm going to share your screen. And then if you can just tell me when you, I probably need to go into slideshow, when you want me to move forward, you're welcome to do so.
Thank you. Everyone can listen and understand me, and video is clear, audio is clear. So yeah, okay, perfect. Well, thanks, Julie, for setting this up. I mean, this has been a lot of work again, kind of after our attempt at running a conference, and it was really, literally the day before the conference, I think, kind of that we had to then cancel. So I'm glad that we can do this, at least in this format, and I'll try simply to summarize what would have been a longer paper. And let me preface this by saying that the debate about marriage, sexuality, partnership, homosexuality, of course, that's been something that's been going on in Germany and in the German academic scene, for quite a while. And about a year ago, I organized a lecture series with my colleagues from Leipzig. So the faculty of the theology department in Leipzig organized a lecture series. So everyone was giving a paper. And typically, you never get the whole faculty together. I mean, that's almost impossible. But with that particular topic, it worked. You know, that was the first and only time that within 10 minutes after I had sent out the request, I had all my colleagues joining in. So which means that there's simply more work to be done. And we're certainly not at the end of a discourse that's been around for quite some time. Now, what I want to be doing in this presentation is look at two chapters in particular that have been particularly pertinent in this debate from the book of Leviticus, so Leviticus 18 and 20. The emphasis will be a little more on 18, and then we'll move slowly into 20. And so this is someone on my door. And if you ever hear a dachshund in the background or see one, yes, that's you know, home office. Yeah, and things natural and unnatural, sexuality and the perversion in the Old Testament. So with Leviticus 18 and 20, and I think we can go immediately into the next slide. So Julie, if you can yeah, thanks. So these are just some preliminary assumptions about you know, the more general notion of how sexuality and perversion are related and what these things are actually. So one of these assumptions from my cultural world would be that sexuality and sexual behaviors are mostly a matter of cultural and social stipulation. So in other words, that's something that can be negotiated and is negotiated in a given setting. So what is considered acceptable or not depends on the norms and the values of a given community. Now, it's the nature of these things that they can change over time. And that's what they do. That's the second point here, that norms and values can, of course, change over time. And we've seen this here in the European discussion, especially with regard to divorce and also things like infidelity and all that. You know, maybe 3 or 4 decades ago, that would have been completely taboo, and it would have been impossible to talk about these things and to see that under certain circumstances, divorce might be not such a bad idea. And but that has really changed over the last 40 years, and now even among religious conservatives, that's not really an issue anymore. So, which is interesting, you know, why did that change occur? What's triggered that? But apart from this realm where norms and values can be negotiated, where they can change and can be adjusted to changing conditions of life, it seems that communities also reserve a certain part of their worldview for things that are considered unnatural or even perverse. So things that do not fall into that or under that rubric of discourse, of moral and ethical discourse and negotiation. So that's something that lies outside that world. And, you know, whatever is unnatural and perverse cannot be salvaged. It cannot be brought back. So it seems to me that this is something that cultures do. I mean, in Germany, for example, again, until the 1960s, 70s, homosexuality was clearly in that rubric of the unnatural and perverse. Now it's been moved back to this more ethically negotiable realm. So apparently these things can change too. You know, whether you put it in one box or the other. Even that seems to be sometimes there seems to be a certain fluidity. So when, how, and under what circumstances do we move sexuality from the social realm to the, well, I called it forbidden territory of the perverse? That's sort of my general question with regard to, well, my own culture, but also with regard to Old Testament texts. And that leads us to Leviticus 18. So that will be the next slide. Yeah, and actually kind of you can click once more, then we get also the text. Thank you. Yeah, Leviticus 18, one of the sort of most debated texts, certainly. And this is just a small portion of one particular set of regulations. I like to call them the prohibitions of uncovering. So in verse 6, you have the general rule here. None of you shall approach anyone near of kin, to uncover, literally. There's the Hebrew word galah, the nakedness, I'm the Lord. Now, people have asked, what is that actually? Kind of, what does it mean? You shall not uncover somebody's nakedness. Some will say that this is just a word for sexual intercourse, so we're really already talking about that. But there are other words for that. There's shachav, to lie with, and other phrases that would probably express that. So galah, in my understanding, has something to do really with entering the intimate sphere, the intimacy of another person. That could be by viewing a person naked, or in a situation that, might expose them in some way. It may be certain behaviors that are not considered acceptable, certain, ways of touching a person, all of that. So I would say this is sort of, that general area of behaviors that are not quite at the level of intercourse, but everything sort of before that. Now, there's a long, long list here in Leviticus 18 of persons whom you, and of course that's always a male that's addressed here, a male single person, persons who are not supposed to be uncovered or treated in that way. And it goes through all the possible family relationships. There's almost everything of a larger family. So here, this is just a small portion. Verse 7 talks about the father and the mother. The next verse moves on to the father's other wife. So the idea is that, of course, under polygamy, you could have more than one. So someone might be thinking about the other woman of one's own father and their family. So it goes into all these tiny little, family tree relationships. Verse 9 mentions the sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's daughter. Again, sort of that goes into different directions of one's genealogy. And so on. These are just a few simple examples. Now, why was that important, or why was that such a need to cover all of this and in that great detail that Leviticus 18 has, or the way it shows? Well, I mean, that's just what you see on the left. I think it's Hatzor in this case, so our archaeological campaign. And just to give you a sense of the small quarters and the tiny and very dense city situation. So those cities were really small, or villages really. So people were really living next to each other. And if you look at Mesopotamian texts, there's a certain awareness. You will witness other people's sexuality because you can't avoid it. You will see people naked. You will witness what people do, especially between noon and 2 o'clock in the afternoon, which is, according to Mesopotamian texts, at the time that people have sex, for example. So, in other words, we in our private worlds, we can basically determine when and how open we want to be about our sexual lives, but that was not really available in the ancient world. And that simply meant that they had to have certain rules, and that's basically what you have in Leviticus 18. So that's the entire area of things that have to be negotiated, ethically, morally negotiated for community life to be able to function and to work. Then we can move on to the next slide. The whole thing. Good, thank you. Now, just to add one component to that, of course, adultery has always been, in the forefront of these texts as a particularly pressing issue if it occurs and when it occurs. And here I wanted to point out one little exegetical and linguistic detail, and that also shows how modern Bible translations sometimes introduce their own assumptions into these texts. So verse 20, Leviticus 18, verse 20 reads like this in the NRS, so New Revised Standard Version. You shall not have sexual relations with your kinsman's wife and defile yourself with her, meaning with that woman. So the woman is seen as the source of impurity, of defiling the man. And now, for those of you who enjoy reading Hebrew, I added that here, and that will tell you that the matter is more complicated. So here it reads, Ve'el eshet amitcha lo titen shiptovcha l'zara l'toma ba. Meaning simply that, and I've given here a very rough literal translation, to the wife of your kinsman, you shall not give your intercourse, which is really interesting. Natan is the verb here, to give, for seed of offspring. This amounts to impurity in it or her. So the very last thing that you see in red there, the ba at the very end, that requires a feminine noun, of course. And that could be either the woman, isha, or eshet in this case, or it could be the word for intercourse, shechobet. And the general rule in Hebrew would be that the suffix and the preposition refers to the noun that's closest to it. And that changes things then, because then it would not be the woman that makes the man unclean or impure, but the fact that they had intercourse. So a working translation of my own would be, with the woman or wife of your neighbor, you shall not have intercourse. This amounts to impurity. So this having intercourse. Just a little detail in terms of, seeing that words matter here. So, but the last slide we had these rules regarding general uncovering. Now, adultery is placed under this rubric of holiness or of cleanness and purity, and now we're moving to the third category, which is now perversion. And there are these infamous verses 22 and 23 that establish certain language and certain behaviors that are now not negotiable anymore, but that are now clearly in that rubric of perversion, which of course also has Hebrew words. So there's toeva and others. So there's language for that even. So, and these are well-known verses. You shall not lie with a male as with a woman. Literally, it would be in positions of a woman. The shiptechei isha would be here the word, also the Hebrew phrasing. It is an abomination. You shall not have sexual relations with any animal and defile yourself in that way. Nor shall any woman give herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. It is perversion. So if we had time, we could go through some of the language here and some of the words that are used. That would be interesting too, but we can't really do that here. So we'll just take it as it is. Now, question, of course, is what do these things have in common? So is this just a combination of things that are seen as perverse and unacceptable and in that rubric of things outside any communal discourse and value? Or is there a little more? Now, if you read commentaries, and particularly the one by Thomas Hieke that I like a lot, typically people will say these are sexual practices that are not conducive to procreation. So these are things that will not produce children, and as such, they are forbidden or prohibited. At the end of the day, that may be true. I would push it even a little further and say there are certain biological assumptions built into that text about what happens in the act of having sex and sort of the biology of procreation that's mentioned here. So what happens there according to Old Testament traditions? That would be on the next slide. Yeah, and as far as I can tell, this has one back. So yeah, that's good. Thank you. From what I can see, it has a lot to do with how they pictured and imagine intercourse works, and especially the role of the male seed or semen. There are a few texts that seem to indicate what they thought was going on. There's, for example, Job 10 and 11, this famous phrase, did you not pour me out like milk and curdle me like cheese? You clothed me with skin and flesh and knit me together with bones and sinews. So that seems to, behind that poetic text, there seem to be some very specific assumptions about what happens in a woman's womb. And the idea seems to be that the male semen sort of materializes. So that's the stuff from which most body parts are made, maybe not all of them, but especially the white body parts. That was the idea, so bones and everything that's white around a body that comes from the male semen. In Greek antiquity, they thought that the more red parts, the reddish parts like muscles and blood vessels, that would come from the woman, but from the mother. Yeah, that would be a cultural question that we can't address here. But that seems to be behind that. And then there's, of course, the other text in Genesis 38, 8 and 9, the Onan episode. They're just, yeah, thanks. So you all know that Onan is required to provide offspring for his deceased brother. And so he doesn't want to do that. So Judah, in this case, said to Onan, go into your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law. To her, raise up offspring for your brothers, or for your brother. But since Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, he spilled, now wasted or ruined his semen on the ground whenever he went into his brother's wife, so that he would not give offspring to his brother. Now here, the interesting word is the shachat. So that's the second one in red that you see in the Hebrew text. So the translations that work with spilled or so, that's not quite what it is. So this is not just, like wasting it away, but the idea is really shachat, so you ruin it. So you take away the capability of that stuff to produce offspring. So there's a potency. So that's sort of almost life stuff, if you want to call it like that. That's a part of it. And I think what's going on in Leviticus 18 is simply, kind of the idea you should not put your semen somewhere where it cannot do what it's supposed to do. So a certain biological understanding of how these things work. And since that's not appropriate, or since that's not conducive to procreation and bringing forth children, it was seen as something unnatural. Now, of course, that was their understanding of the unnatural. Whereas we today have, of course, a different understanding of biology, which means, well, our rules may be different from theirs. So that's just as a mini excursus, and now we can move to the next slide. So if one now looks at 18 and summarizes that real briefly, just have to make sure that I keep time. There are two sets of criteria applied to sexual behavior. One, the question is what is unsocial, or what is social and not social, and what is irresponsible. So the focus is on communal well-being. That's the criterion for these laws, not to uncover the nakedness of people of your own family, larger family. And then there's the other set of questions, or the other side, that asks, what is unnatural? So the focus is on what is perceived as natural order. And within the same chapter, certain behaviors are assigned to the one area and others to the other. And now the question would be, why did they assign these different rules or behaviors to these categories? Was there a certain logic behind that, or and that's, I think, a very open question, but you can actually kind of see that there are these two patterns at work, and sort of they interact in ways that we don't always understand. Things become a little more problematic and at the same time more clear when we move to Leviticus 20. So let's look at that real quickly. That would be the next slide. Yeah. Leviticus 20 is essentially a longer version, to a certain extent longer, sometimes also shorter, version of Leviticus 18. So there's debate over whether Leviticus 20 is sort of an update or a rewriting of Leviticus 18, which I think is a likely assumption. And if you just, look at this chapter and the verses that I've picked here real quickly, we can't go through any of the details, of course. There are a few things that are interesting. First of all, now we're talking about intercourse all the way through. So we're not talking about uncovering things anymore. So it's not about this negotiating sort of the line between what's appropriate and not, but now we're really, when a man lies with a woman, so pretty clear that's that. So I've, highlighted that in red a little bit, that now the language changes. The other thing that's striking is that now these three laws that sort of are separated and singled out in 18 about perversion, they are now nestled into the larger chapter. So suddenly they are, kind of broken up a little bit. As you can tell, verse 13 takes up the problem or the question of whether two men can lie together, can have sexual intercourse together. And then there's something between in verse 14, and then 15 and 16 pick up the whole animal thing. So suddenly, that's presented almost as a flow of all kinds of regulations. So there is no clear separation anymore between the moral discourse and the perversion side of things. In other words, in Leviticus 20 now, we have the case that almost everything, every sexual behavior that's not considered appropriate is now moved into that perversion category. And that's a pretty strong move, and one that I find interesting, that within the Hebrew Bible, you can see that from one chapter basically to the next, to the other, something happens, a certain dynamic takes place. And again, question is, kind of what's happened here between 18 and 20. Are these different authors? Are these different times? Are these different worldviews? All of that, those are questions and to which I don't necessarily have an answer. So let's move to the next and final slide. Yeah, this is again just a little bit of a summary, and I used here one of Phyllis Tribble's famous terms. So is Leviticus 20 then a text of terror? Looking at or facing the reality that between 18 and 20 we have sort of this radicalizing tendency. So again, this is to summarize things. So if one compares these two chapters, it becomes evident that Leviticus 20 moves almost all sexual activities and practices that occur outside the bonds of a heterosexual marriage into the sphere of the unnatural and perverse. So that seems to be relatively clear, although maybe not. I mean, some exegetes would disagree on that, and maybe you do too. Will be interesting for our conversation. Another thing that stands out, unlike Leviticus 18, 20 establishes casuistic and criminal law, including severe forms of punishment. So in Leviticus 18, there was just, don't do this, shy away from that, but there were no threats of punishment, and 20 is as explicit as it could be, because practically for every misbehavior, there's a death penalty. So that also makes things a little more extreme. So question is, should one view Leviticus 20 as a radicalized version of 18 that effectively eliminates the sphere of socio-ethical stipulation in favor of relying on a definition of what is natural and unnatural? So is that what's going on in 20, that really the only criteria on which they rely is this distinction between natural and unnatural, which is sort of also a definition of perversion. So this is my general observation or my general observations about these two chapters. If I had a little more time, but maybe I can at least say two sentences, I talked about 18 and 20. Now, the good question could be, what about 19? So there's a chapter between those two. Typically, one would assume that if this is a legal discourse, then the new law would stand right next or after the older law that it revises or reshapes. And that's precisely not the case with 18 and 20, but there's 19 in the middle, which has, of course, some of the very important texts like the love commandment. And so, again, just to throw in a certain little theory of my own, I think Leviticus 19 is trying to sort of reposition that entire ethical discourse, so away from body fluids, a little bit away from just matters of that only sexuality matters, and refocus it on what's really important, such as love your neighbor. So within these three chapters, and again, that's just, I think, fascinating in terms of interbiblical hermeneutics, there's a lot of dialogue going on. There are different positions. Some more radical than others. Some try to negotiate. Some try to probably also build bridges between different parties. So it's almost like a discourse and discussion of our own time. That you have the extremes, but also you have everything in the middle. And in other words, these texts don't necessarily establish a particular norm that we could simply pick up and run with, but in a sense, they offer us a discussion, sort of an open discourse in which we have to position ourselves. Some might tend to more the radical end of things. Others might choose to have a more distinctive or more nuanced kind of debate that we have in Leviticus 18. So in other words, although these texts have been used to establish norms within theology and within the church, I don't think that this is what they wanted to do within the biblical world and biblical times. Okay, so much from my side for today, and I hope that was about 25 minutes.
No, it's perfect. Your timekeeping has been impeccable. So thank you so much, Andreas, for that. Colleagues, for those of you, welcome, who joined us a bit late. As you see, we have two presenters. So Professor Andreas Schuler from Leipzig University is also visiting, extraordinary visiting professor in our department of Old and New Testament, Stellenbosch University. And I will now continue my presentation. I just would like to ask those of you who have just recently joined not to use the chat, the chat function. And while the presenters are speaking, after I've spoken, hopefully also just as good time as my colleague, we will have half an hour time of conversation, and then you are welcome to post also questions in the chat function. So when I was asked, when Andreas and I started conceptualizing this and talked about this conference, I told him that if I'm to do something on rethinking perversion, it has to be either in the book of Jonah or Nahum, as those are my two big writing projects for the next couple of years. Jonah wasn't going to work, so I've actually found a very interesting sort of aspect of this topic in the book of Nahum, especially thinking of the bloody city and the image of the bloody city in Nahum 3:1-7. So I start my paper by referencing two biblical texts, one Nahum 3:1 and the second one Ezekiel 22:2. Ah, city of bloodshed, utterly deceitful, full of booty, no end to the plunder. And then Ezekiel 22:2, you mortal, will you judge the bloody city, then declare to it all its abominable deeds. So feminist scholars have long since noted the virulent language of sexual violence that's used in the prophetic discourse to denote the downfall of a besieged city and her inhabitants. Whether it be personified Jerusalem in Lamentations 1:2, Jeremiah 13:22, or daughter Babylon in Isaiah 47 or Jeremiah 51, or the whore Nineveh in Nahum 3:1-7, who is on the receiving end of the devastating violence of military warfare, the commonalities associated with this evocative metaphor are clear. The threat or the reality of the city's destruction, the penetration of its defenses, the ravaging of its innermost sanctuary, all are encapsulated in the metaphor of a violated, weeping, humiliated female body. However, beyond the troubling appropriation of sexual violence in the prophetic discourse, which is not only used to capture Judah's own sense of self before, amidst, and in the aftermath of military invasion, but also extends to enemy cities as an integral part of Judah's coming to terms with trauma, there's a whole range of layers, connotations, as well as implications associated with this particular prophetic metaphor. For instance, in terms of the occurrence of this metaphor in Nahum 3:1, cited in the beginning of this paper, one finds the reference to Nineveh as city of bloodshed, which also may be translated as bloody city. In conversation with scholars like Eva Feinstein's work on sexual pollution and Elizabeth Goldstein on impurity and gender in the Hebrew Bible, this paper considers the way in which the language of sexual perversion has or pollution has informed the metaphor of the city as an adulterous woman or prostitute that in Ezekiel 22:2 is described as the bloody city or the city of bloodshed. According to Feinstein, Ezekiel's condemnation of the bloody city is closely associated with laws detailing perversion, pollution, or abomination in Leviticus 18 and 20, and that Andreas has just discussed just before. That also includes the law prohibiting sexual relations with a menstruating woman in Leviticus 18:19 and 20:18. This paper proposes that a more nuanced understanding of the layers, connotations, and implications of the way in which perversion and disgust are understood in these biblical traditions also may inform our understanding of yet another city of bloodshed, as the downfall of Nineveh, Israel's most revered enemy, is celebrated in Nahum 3:1 and further. So in the first instance, the layers. The assumptions and worldviews underlying the portrayal of sexual violence in the prophetic discourse come from somewhere. Eva Feinstein's work on sexual pollution in the Hebrew Bible offers a fascinating account of the legacy of the laws in Leviticus 18 and 20 concerning perversion, or what she calls pollution, in two texts, that is Ezekiel 22 and Ezra 9. Drawing on the work by Elizabeth Goldstein on impurity and gender in Leviticus, Ezekiel, and Ezra, Feinstein identifies a number of close parallels between the portrayal of the bloody city in Ezekiel 22:2 and the laws in Leviticus 18 and 20 that dictate a range of mostly sexual behavior that is classified to be perverse or abominable, which has the effect of polluting, defiling, or contaminating the body, both individually and collectively. These chapters include, among others, laws outlining incest and bestiality, in addition to texts that typically have been weaponized in terms of the conversation on homosexuality. But probably most unexpected amid the list of sexual actions that is considered to be perverse is the law against drawing near to a woman while she is menstruating. In Leviticus 15:24, typically taken to be part of the priestly tradition, sexual relations with a menstruating woman are not prohibited, but rather it stipulates the period of time the male partner is considered to be unclean. In Leviticus 18 and 20, that form part of what is known as the Holiness Code, a distinct change occurs, though, when sex with a menstruating woman is clearly forbidden. Whereas in Leviticus 18:19, sex with a menstruating woman is prohibited because it makes one impure, in Leviticus 20:18, having sex with a menstruating woman has become a moral issue. In Tyria Phillips' words, a defiling sin with irreversible results that's considered on par with incest, bestiality, and child sacrifice to Molech. In the book of Ezekiel, this connection between impurity, immorality, and gender is even more pronounced when the figure of a menstruating woman comes to represent the sins of the people of Judah. Both Feinstein and Goldstein show how Ezekiel draws upon some of the ideas found particularly in H. However, as evident in the figure of the bloody city, the Ir Hadamim in Ezekiel 22:2, the female blood that in the priestly tradition was considered to be inherently unclean with the potential to defile or pollute, in Ezekiel inadvertently is connected to immorality. Goldstein in particular makes a compelling case for three interwoven interpretative possibilities associated with the city of bloodshed that draw upon three different meanings of damim in order to capture this movement from impurity to immorality. First, the reference to Jerusalem as a bloody city may on the one hand refer to the abundance of spilt blood of those killed, thus denoting the acts of violence and also the violation in her midst. However, given the fact that this city, as also other cities in the ancient Near East, may in the second instance also refer to menstruation, as Jerusalem is depicted as a woman who bleeds. And in the third instance, the reference to the city of bloodshed may be understood in terms of the blood guilt Jerusalem had incurred because of the crimes committed within her walls. Merging these three meanings, one could say that it's because the blood of those murdered within her walls is exposed, calling from the ground, much as the blood of Abel cried out to God in Genesis 4:10, that God is stepping forward in order to avenge the blood guilt that is associated with this city of bloodshed. Moreover, the writer of Ezekiel is superimposing the image of the bloody woman and the bloody city by intentionally confusing moral impurity with ritual impurity. As Goldstein argues, by linking menstrual blood with blood guilt, the prophet is explicit in his condemnation of female blood. This line of interpretation is also evident elsewhere in Ezekiel, in which a connection is made between the people worshipping other gods that is depicted in terms of the metaphor of an adulterous woman or a prostitute, as the people defile the land with their ways and their deeds, in Ezekiel 36:17. As God pronounces, their conduct in my sight was like the uncleanness of a woman in a menstrual period. Indeed, as Goldstein puts it, the bleeding woman has become the symbol for everything that's wrong with Israel. By connecting the notion of blood guilt to a range of immoral, or in Ezekiel's mind, abhorrent behaviors that go back to the legal tradition of the Holiness Code, for instance, defiling oneself by worshipping other idols, oppressing the widow, spilling innocent blood, profaning the Sabbath, committing incest, having sexual intercourse with a menstruating woman, menstrual blood, which in the priestly tradition was considered to be a small involuntary ritual defilement, thus has been turned into something so negative and shameful that it represents all of the sins of Israel that's great enough to cause the eviction of the people from the land. Divine violence and exile becomes thus, according to Feinstein, both a just punishment as well as an act of purification. Second, connotations. So how did a bodily function shared by most all women around the world and from the beginning of time, one that transcends ethnicity, class, sexual orientation, and age, become such a despised phenomenon with the propensity to be viewed as something perverse on the same level as incest and bestiality? In the first instance, it's important to note that in many cultures and times, menstruation is viewed with contempt as something dirty, or in stronger terms, abhorrent or revolting. Mary Douglas, in her seminal work on purity and danger, speaks about pollution in terms of dirt as matter out of place. Analogously, one could say that menstruation may be viewed as blood out of place, and together with other bodily fluids, specifically associated with sexual organs, exhibit the innate ability to contaminate individuals who come into contact with it. On an evolutionary level, Feinstein demonstrates how disgust could have functioned as a type of protective measure in terms of, for instance, contaminated food that conceivably could be considered harmful. However, one finds as well that disgust inevitably also extends to individuals who are deemed outsiders to the community, and hence posing a real or more often a perceived threat. In what Martha Nussbaum describes as misogynist disgust, women as the ultimate other in particular are scorned or reviled in terms of the fear of female sexuality and a heightened aversion of female emissions, something which is epitomized in the deeply ingrained connection between menstruation and disgust. There is a wealth of examples in popular culture that attest to what Lauren Rosewarne describes as the menstrual mess: disgust, horror, and the fear of menstruation. In a fascinating account on the manifold ways in which the topic of menstruation features in books, films, and television, Rosewarne cites a scene from the film To Sir with Love in 1967, in which the teacher, played by Sidney Poitier, refers to a sanitary product burned by the kids in class as a disgusting object. He furthermore reprimands the responsible student by saying, "A decent woman keeps certain things private. Only a filthy slut would have done this." An additional moral dimension that draws a connection between disgust and distrust is furthermore evident in the popular expression, "I just don't trust anything that bleeds for 5 days and doesn't die," as voiced by the character Mr. Garrison in the film South Park, Bigger, Longer, and Uncut in 1999. Rosewarne argues that this quote, as also other variations of this quote elsewhere in popular culture, boasts the same misogynist undercurrent, rendering the menstruator as abject and presenting menstruation as something not only abhorrent but potentially non-human. Often described as the curse of Eve, menstruation moreover comes to expresses the ideal that women are masters of deception, as evident also in the concealment of menstruation. Given the very long history of the idea of women, of female sexuality as being evil, or at least instigating evil consequences that goes back to the biblical story of Eve, according to Rosewarne, it is not surprising that on-screen portrayals of periods frequently reference long-standing misogynist ideas about one of the most female biological functions. It's precisely this deeply ingrained connection between menstruation and disgust in popular culture, with its deep roots in the Judeo-Christian traditions, that helps us to make sense of the laws concerning sex with a menstruating woman in the Holiness Code in Leviticus. Feinstein clearly shows how the author of Leviticus 18 seeks to persuade his audience of the wrongness of a number of mostly sexual actions by employing a strong connection between disgust and pollution language and imagery. By calling the sexual actions prohibited in these chapters, including also sex with a menstruating woman, abominable and perverse, the land is depicted as having a visceral reaction, literally vomiting out its inhabitants in Leviticus 18, 24 to 28. As Feinstein describes this rhetorical strategy in the following way: this appeal to disgust makes the wrongness of these acts seem self-evident, and by including broadly accepted taboos alongside more controversial restrictions, the text encourages the audience to extend an existing repugnance towards certain relationships to a broader range of behaviors. Moreover, in texts concerning the bloody city in the book of Ezekiel, this connection between disgust and the menstruating woman is even more pronounced. For instance, in Ezekiel 24:6, the reference to the bloody city is directly connected to disgust when the prophet in a sign act is commanded to create a bloody mixture of putrid animal flesh and bones with a layer of rust, or pot scum, translated by Goldstein as filth, in an iron cooking pot in order to represent the blood of the city. This revolting combination is a good example of how the multiple levels of blood associated with the female city is considered to be repulsive. And in Ezekiel 23:45, a connection is furthermore drawn between the adulterous woman and the triple understanding of blood on their hands, which may, as outlined in the previous section, section, I just omitted somebody there. Yes, in the previous section, conceivably referred to bloodshed, blood guilt, as well as menstruation. Assumption of a woman being unfaithful, a deceptive adulteress, or an immoral prostitute are hence conflated with the emotion of disgust that has come to be associated with menstruation, so generating, as Goldstein contends, a new conceptualization of women in the female body, according to which their menstruating bodies can become the symbol of sin and the symbol of leading others into sin through unholy intercourse. Moreover, as evidence in the examples of the metaphors of sexual violence in the prophetic discourse cited in the beginning of this paper, a logical next step would be to view the invasion and violent destruction of the female cities as their rightfully deserved punishment that she asked for its response so many victims of sexual and domestic violence have had to endure. So, implications. So what are the implications of this exercise in delving through the layers and connotations associated with the image of the bloody city in Ezekiel 22:2 for reading the depiction of Nineveh as a city of bloodshed in Nahum 3:1? First, I propose in this paper that the depiction of Nineveh as the bloody city in Nahum 3:1 might be enhanced by exploring the layers and connotations of the occurrence of a similar portrayal of the city of Jerusalem in Ezekiel 22:2 that has been the topic of inquiry in this paper. In this regard, the multiple layers associated with the city of bloodshed in Ezekiel 22:2 may be helpful for our understanding of Nahum 3:1. Nineveh is indeed a bloody city, filled with the blood of the numerous dead bodies associated with the fall of the city. The blood of those killed is expounded by invoking vivid images of corpses that are left unburied, that is described as a multitude of slain, masses of corpses, and no end to dead bodies. Moreover, in light of the fact that Nineveh had been responsible for great bloodshed, suggests also that the reference to the bloody city may refer as well to the blood guilt associated with the history of violence attributed to the capital city of the Assyrian Empire, the fall of Nineveh being celebrated by the author of Nahum as her just reward for all that she has done to Israel. Though one may also consider that, as Laurel Lanner rightly observes, the notion of blood guilt, as elsewhere in prophetic discourse, does not only pertain to acts of military warfare, but also to those instances in which those in a position of power and privilege engage in social justice violations. In addition, as also in the case of the city of Jerusalem, Nineveh is depicted as a female entity, hence suggesting, as in the case of Ezekiel 22:2, that one may read this text as invoking the image of a bleeding, menstruating city with all the connotations of not only ritual impurity, but also moral guilt associated with this depiction of sexual perversion or pollution. In this regard, it's significant that Nineveh is quite vividly depicted in this text as a whore, a derogatory slur that often is used to denote those others than themselves. In addition to the countless debaucheries of the prostitute, Nahum 3:4, in which Nineveh is said to engage, she is moreover called the mistress of sorcery, a twofold reference that, according to Klaas Spronk, represents two aspects of her evil power, that is, harlotry as the ability of seducing others, and sorcery as enforcing her will upon others with her, what the text describes as gracefully alluring feminine wiles. In conversation with the layers and connotations associated with the bloody city in Ezekiel 22:2, outlined in this paper, the portrayal of the bloody city in Nahum 3 is furthermore permeated with disgust. This is evident in the grisly scene of unburied corpses, clearly signifying ritual pollution, which forms the backdrop of this portrayal of the city of bloodshed. The multiple layers of meaning associated with the bloody city, which conceivably include associations with menstrual blood, clearly convey a sense of disgust or revulsion with regard to the fallen city. Indeed, the bloody city has become the subject of great scorn, as God's contempt for Nineveh is manifested in God's act of throwing filth or excrement at her in Nahum 3:6. In conjunction also with the metaphorical depiction of a prostitute, a sorceress, that features prominently in this text, there is a general sense of pollution, or one might say perversion, associated with the portrayal of this capital city of one of Israel's most dreaded foes. Second, the fact that menstruation has come to represent a moral category in Ezekiel 22, when an image of menstruating women as a symbol for all evil also extends to the occurrence of this metaphor in Nahum, when the depiction of a bloody city, with all the associations outlined above, serves as a means to justify violence. Whereas in Ezekiel, the intertwined notion of immorality and disgust was encapsulated in the figure of a revolting, menstruating woman with violence following in its wake, in the case of Nahum, the whole added layer of revulsion is added when Nineveh, the capital city of the much feared enemy empire, is not just the female other, but also the enemy female other. Steve Davidson, reading from a post-colonial perspective, shows how imperialist discourse, which is deeply masculinist in nature, typically employs sexually and religiously deviant forms of the core representations of women. One furthermore has to be mindful of how the other is constructed in prophetic discourse, even and perhaps especially the enemy other. Karen Sharp warns us to be extremely vigilant when it comes to the virulent language of military despoliation and the sexual shaming of enemies one finds in Jeremiah, but even more so in the book of Nahum. Language that propagates the dehumanization of the enemy others, which furthermore employs female bodies to conjure up the strongest form of disgust, is just plain dangerous, especially in today's volatile geopolitical climate. A compelling example is found in the thought-provoking essay by Daniel Smith Christopher on reading Ezekiel in Abu Ghraib, shortly after US soldiers have engaged in dehumanizing practices of their prisoners. Smith Christopher writes, Abu Ghraib, like Sand Creek, My Lai, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, reveals instead that militarism only reduces us to a disturbing immoral similarity to the ancient empires who conquered the biblical Hebrews. We resemble our enemies. So in conclusion, taking into consideration the theme of this conference, the power to discriminate, we have seen in this paper examples of priests and prophets who very much have determined what and also who is considered to be abominable or perverse. The formulation of the bloody city in Ezekiel 22 was shown to have been deeply rooted in the legal traditions in Leviticus, and specifically pertaining to the Holiness Code's prohibition of having sex with a menstruating woman. But as was also evident in this paper, both the prophetic rhetoric's application of the legal traditions and the original laws in the holiness tradition go back to some deep-seated connotations between disgust and menstruation, as well as assumptions about sexuality and gender, both in the biblical traditions as well as in popular culture. We also have seen in the legacy of the prophetic metaphor of the bloody city that the power to discriminate is never innocent, and how what is considered to be perverse, generating disgust and repulsion, very soon may lead to violence when what is considered abhorrent is to be expunged. In this regard, in her expose on the legacy of biblical violence, Yvonne Sherwood highlights the dangers of prophetic rhetoric that so blatantly employs violence in the exposed human bodies at the level of symbol, which she argues also extends into the violence of form. As she argues, force is embodied in the performance of an absolute, sovereign, and absolutely irrevocable, irresistible discourse. Iteration, reiteration, the voice without limits, speaking and acting as if there were no other voices, bodies, or counterforces in the world. Perhaps this is the real danger lurking in the priests' and the prophets' formulations of metaphors and laws associated with perversion. Voices without limits, these laws and prophetic rhetoric speak and act as if there were no other voices, bodies, or counterforces in the world. In this regard, by considering the layers and connotations and the implications associated with this particular prophetic metaphor found in Ezekiel 22 as well as Nahum 3, the bloody city talks back so as to at least give us some insight into those other voices and bodies constructed by those who have the power to discriminate. Thank you. Colleagues, at this point, I will also ask maybe Andreas if you would like to switch on his microphone, unmute also. And then you are welcome to ask questions. You can either do that by raising your hand, and there's a hand function, or by typing in the meeting chat, and I and Andreas both can sort of look at some of the questions that come in. And we have more or less a half an hour of conversation time. So.
It's now this moment.
Okay, I see someone. Who is that who's asking? Hendrik Bosman, Professor Bosman. So if you would welcome to ask your question. Thanks. And you can switch on your, if you want to, or you can just speak. Yeah, or you can switch on your video if you would prefer.
Good afternoon, and colleagues. Am I clearly audible?
We are struggling a bit to hear you, but otherwise you can. So you can maybe try, or otherwise type it in the So, but yeah, so you're welcome to try.
Okay, let's see this. Okay, Andreas, the relationship between chapter 18 and 20, against the background of how do you relate Leviticus 1 to 16 and then 17 onwards as a type of Fortschreibung or whatever, where priestly instruction attempted to relate them to Deuteronomistic type of instruction, and that there is not necessarily a linear development from 18 to 20, but almost a coexistence of existing priestly type of instruction and then attempts to somehow accommodate a parallel tradition to make it a one stream type of tradition. So not that you imply that there's a linear type of progression, but almost a new emergence of an attempt at combining traditions, and that the older and the younger combination coexist. The second question to Julie, it's interesting. I mean, city, ear is feminine. So it's an interesting play with the "Oh Bloody City." Preempting what I'll be arguing next week, that honor and shame can be brought into the equation. It's interesting how very, very strong images of shaming is brought in, especially from verse 5 onwards, where the capital honorable city of the Assyrians are now being shamed, dishonored in very, very explicit terms. So that can be an interesting add-on to your explanation or interpretation. Thank you.
Thank you. Andreas, thank you so much, because you were very clear. Andreas, if you want to answer and then also respond, if you can see in the chat function, there's also been a response of a question from Alfonso. So if you can see that, so you're welcome to respond to both those questions, and then I'll respond.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, thanks, Hendrik, for the question. I can only agree with what you just presented. Yes, I mean, I didn't really go into the difficult question of what's Leviticus 20 really over against 18. And I would agree that this is an update of 18, but including other legal materials as well. That I think one could show in relatively great detail. What strikes me is sort of, it moves to the more radical. That's something where I'm not sure where that's coming from. That's not necessarily Deuteronomy. I mean, well, maybe it is, but I mean, there's a tendency that I don't quite understand, and that's really an open question to me, kind of why did they push these things so much into the area of everything is perverse, everything requires the death penalty, and that I don't see in either 18 or in Deuteronomy or elsewhere, to be perfectly honest. So that's something where I'm not quite sure, but I mean, for the general literary criticism, I would agree that the way that you described it's Leviticus 18 plus parts of Deuteronomy, maybe some parts of the priestly regulation, if you agree that the priestly stuff is older than the whole code. Yes. And Alfonso, maybe you have not really said much about the so-called homosexuality prohibition. Do you want to specify what exactly you want me to talk some more about? So just that I'm moving in the right direction.
So Alfonso, if you want to maybe type that, or if you want to just speak.
Or Julie, if you want to answer that first, and then.
Oh, I'll type. He's going to type.
Okay.
So, okay. So while he's typing, so Bosi, yes, thank you so much. I mean, that's a great. Yeah, that's a great point and observation. And I mean, I think definitely this, of course, in terms of the enemy other, I mean, there's the notion of shaming and humiliation, which is a whole different other dynamic than speaking also about Jerusalem, which is also experiencing the shame and humiliation. And I think, the fact that the cities, I mean, it's so interesting, it opens up a whole series of connotations, the vulnerability of the city, there's the shaming of the city, and I think, especially then also thinking about the enemy other, a whole extra range of connotations is added to that. Yeah, so I think that definitely, I mean, and then again, you can think about the layers and the connotations, even why women become so much associated also with shame sort of in terms of that, so that it's part of a worldview that sort of that attribute that also in terms of our honor and shame in terms of women as well, and that it normalizes. You can see that that shaming can be allowed. Alfonso is still typing. Anybody else? Bosie, if you could maybe just lower your hand, or if you have another question, you're welcome to ask that. Otherwise, you can just lower your hand. Anybody else who wants to ask a question? Let me just say, I mean, it's an interesting observation also about why it's more difficult. Yeah, Sias, I was going to say, Sias will tell us why it's so intensified in Leviticus 20, and he'll probably also speak about that next week. So, but Sias.
Okay, can I talk? Yeah, this is just so complicated, the relationship between 18, 19, and 20, and I think it's important, and Andreas did go in that direction towards the end, that you cannot read 18 and 20 without reading 19, and there are certain things. I know it sounded as if Bosie was shying away from linear arguments, but there are arguments, if you look at the paranetic frame, which sort of stretches through all 3 chapters, that there's a certain development there. But yeah, it is complicated, and I don't want to say too much now, because then I'm going to go ahead of myself, or I'm going to start talking about my own paper next week. So I just look forward to next week, I think, with me and Bosie together, and it's obvious that there's a lot of overlap between Andreas today and also a lot of what you did, Julie. What I'm just, yeah, okay, no, that's fine. So I don't know. I just think you cannot throw 19 away. You must read 19 with 18 and 20. And yeah, apart from that, I don't really know all the answers. So sorry.
No, but I hopefully everybody comes back next week, so stay tuned. This is an ongoing conversation. So thank you so much, Sias. And Sias and Bosie will be presenting next week. So
I think that's ideal, kind of you guys can give the answers, next week. So we just simply prepared the question. Okay, and now I just read Alfonso's question, or Julie, is it okay if I respond to that now?
Please go.
I mean, the more I'm getting into this, the language of these verses and of 22 in particular, and in chapter 18, kind of the more difficult it gets. And if you add sort of the ancient Near Eastern stuff, then it's even more unclear to me what's really what really the issue is. Because, even the language, kind of, who is the addressee of that particular verse? Is it the one, the passive or the active part? I mean, as you know, this is sort of has been debated, kind of, is this something that says you should not be the female part in this relationship? That's prohibited, kind of, but it would be okay if you're the active part. If you read it like that, that would be very much in line with Mesopotamian law, where the only question is always, is it in agreement with your social status? So someone of a higher status, should not be in the position of a woman in a homosexual encounter. I mean, homosexual is a difficult word here, I know, because it's not what we mean by it. But if you choose to engage in this kind of practice, then social status suddenly matters. And punishable in Mesopotamia was only, kind of the kind of sex that you had when you lowered yourself too much, given your social rank. So, kind of all of that makes this whole debate so difficult. But one thing is clear to me, it's really about the practice, it's about social status, it's about biological assumptions, but it's certainly not about homosexuality. I mean, this is not about, if and to what extent 2 men or 2 women could live together. I mean, that's not on the horizon of these texts. And that, I think, is the reason why we sometimes ask wrong questions when we approach these texts. I mean, that, I think, is something that most exegetes would agree, kind of we confront this text with our own life worlds, where it has become possible, kind of that homosexual relationship work out because we don't have the same kind of economic background anymore. You know, kind of, I mean, we don't expect a marriage also to be sort of the economic engine of the larger family, of a tribe, you know, kind of where things have to work. It's not about romance, but it's also about simply, you know, kind of something like a little firm almost that works. And, you know, kind of these things seem to be important for the ancient world. And I think that's why that the homosexual side was excluded, because one could not count on that. It didn't do what it would have been required to do. That is very different in our own time. You know, we can conceive of these relationships and we can accept them socially because we don't have the same requirements and needs for marriage or that kind of thing. So yeah, I mean, I guess it doesn't get more easy when you think about it, but I would really separate the concerns behind Leviticus 18, clearly social status, power relationships between guys, between men, and our discussion about life forms. I think these things don't mix and mingle.
Excellent. Yeah, very interesting conversation. Sias, your hand's still up, or you have another question? Also,
No, I didn't. But actually, I have one now. So
okay. I see your hand.
That was my mistake. But this is a question related to what Andreas just said and the previous explanation of, and this is one of the classical explanations of semen out of place, that the semen is not where it's supposed to be. But where does the verse 21, the giving your children to Molech, how does that fit in there, or does it fit in superficially because children is actually called seed? So when I look at it, that explains some of it. That explains verse 20. Verse 21. It explains a man sleeping with another man, or why an animal may not sleep with a woman. But yeah, how do you explain then the Molech thing? Where does that fit in?
Well, Sias, you will explain that because you're writing the commentary on Leviticus. But
I only get there in 8 years' time, so it's in the future.
Yeah, well, the problem with that is that this particular verse is right, you know, between on the one hand these uncovering laws where it's about galan, all of that, and then these other things that have something to do with sexual encounters, and it's right the verse between the two. So, you know, kind of now you could argue it goes together with the previous verses, so basically with 1 through 20. Or it goes together with what follows. And you know, to some extent, I wouldn't push composition too much in that regard. You know, kind of, I don't think that everything has to fit with everything else in that respect. I mean, certainly the notion of perversion is there. So it's unnatural to sacrifice your children in that way, just as it's unnatural for two guys to have sex with each other or with an animal. So at that general level of perversion, I think they go together, but not the more thematic aspects. I think that's probably a separate kind of discourse.
It's very interesting. Others, questions? We have quite a few. I just also want to welcome University of Pretoria. I think almost all of the colleagues are here. Quite a few of your students also. So it's wonderful to have you also here. Yeah, so we have other colleagues from the Faculty of Theology, non-biblical scholars. Your support and interest also in this very strange book is well noted. So thank you so much for being here. So we can also entertain non-biblical experts' sort of views and thoughts on this topic. Bosi, welcome. Okay, Bosi, you're muted, so maybe you could just unmute.
Andreas, if I could ask you, to what extent would you agree that creation and the supposed order introduced by creation plays a programmatic role within Leviticus? Because there are many, especially American colleagues, who can't find any conclusive evidence in 18 and 20, and then they fall back. But okay, Leviticus as a whole is almost a rethinking of creation and how do you appropriate within a cultic environment. How would you respond to that type of almost rescuing that this is against creational order or whatever?
Yeah, I was afraid someone was going to ask that question, kind of, because I would like, as an exegete, I would like to give a different answer than the one that I think one has to give in that respect. I mean, I would simply agree that Leviticus 18 and 20 talk about the order of creation. I mean, the way they establish what's natural, what's not natural, combine that with holiness. I think these are really texts that want to make the point that this is the created order. And so in a sense, I mean, if you look at Genesis 1, you know, you're safe, you know, kind of, that's not a text that will get you in any kind of trouble with that kind of debate. Certainly not, but 18 and 20, yeah, I mean, I think they do make this notion, but what they do, and that's would be my more critical hermeneutical turn, they combine nature with creation. So they make that equation, you know, creation has to be nature and vice versa. And that I would challenge hermeneutically, theologically, you know, is that really the same? Even in Genesis 1, it's not the same. I mean, the world that Genesis 1 describes is not real in many ways, you know, kind of the real world doesn't work like that because we eat meat and all that happy stuff, you know. So I guess some of the biblical traditions show a certain awareness of there's nature and there's creation, and Leviticus 18 sort of throws them all together. So yes, unfortunately, to some extent, it is about creation. But then again, I think one does need to apply a certain critical hermeneutic at that point.
Great. Any other comments, questions? Yes?
Okay, sorry. With regard to the previous question, another obvious link is the Sabbath, the seventh day, and the Sabbath plays a very important role in the Holiness Code. So, yeah, especially if you look at 19, there is a commandment to honor the Sabbath. So, yeah, there obviously are these links because the authors of the Holiness Code were, in my understanding, a later generation of priests, and they were working with the basic presuppositions of priestly worldview and how the priest would view the world. But apart from that, and that there must be order in the world, yeah, so in essence, apart from adding the Sabbath, I would agree with what Andreas just said. And more than that, I cannot really add.
Yeah, although priests probably, I mean, the priests behind Leviticus 18 and 20 are not necessarily the same as in the priestly code and other parts of the Pentateuch. I mean, I guess
no, definitely not. Yeah.
Could be different. But yeah, I mean, Sabbath is definitely a link, but then again, I mean, what I like about Genesis 1 is that it hints at the Sabbath, but it doesn't establish it. It says, you know, there's a world out there where no one observes the Sabbath, and that is okay for those who are not Israelites. So even there's sort of a distinction between, you know, certain things only apply to some people. And whereas the Holiness Code sort of has a tendency to lump this together. That's sort of my level of discomfort, shall we say, with some of the theology that's going on there. You know, and although it's admirable, I mean, to really add in holiness as a dimension and to say that life has to be holy, I mean, that's of course a very intriguing concept. And I guess Professor Bosman will be talking about that next week. So that would be a constructive move, and one, you know, to see how holiness could be developed in terms that perhaps doesn't fall into the same traps that I would say have occurred, at least in certain places of Leviticus 18 and 20.
Good. Anybody else? If I don't see other hands, we don't have to meet until 4:30. I think we all have realized that meeting online is sort of quite taxing on the sensations and so we don't want to keep you longer than we have to. So maybe if I don't see another hand, it's just, say thank you so much for tuning in. It's been wonderful. Andreas, thank you so much for also your lecture and for, sort of for us, sort of not letting go of this initiative. And also we look forward also to next week, which Professor Hendrik Bosman and Professor C.S. Meyer from Pretoria. So they will be presenting. It will be the same type of format. So we look forward also to your presentations and continuing the conversation. There will be a recording of this. So if you want to have access to this recording and also to send it to other people, you will be able to have it. It actually works very well. It's in the Google Stream. So you can just forward the email. You can ask Estelle to forward that to you or forward to her. And then, you can also then forward it to somebody else who might be interested in listening to this seminar. Otherwise, we'll see you next week. And thank you so much, Estelle, also for this and all the arrangements associated with this. Okay, so I'll be ending the recording now, and then we'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.